the institutional memory of any nation is bound up in the unspoken spaces of its great houses, those silent limestone monuments that stand as physical manifestations of permanence in an era defined by rapid and often volatile cultural shifts. To watch the gathering of a dynasty under the pale sunlight of an English weekend is to observe a ritual that is as much about the calculated display of internal cohesion as it is about celebration. A major family event, drawing together the highest tiers of the established order, offers the public a rare, sweeping panorama of those who remain within the circle of grace and those who have slipped beyond its perimeter. The occasion, ostensibly a gathering of joy and familial continuity, serves simultaneously as a silent inventory of presence and absence, where the omission of certain prominent figures speaks with a far greater volume than the polite chatter of the guests assembled on the lawns. Every smile captured by the long lenses of the press, every coordinated arrival, and every subtle gesture of solidarity among the cousins who grew up behind palace walls becomes part of a larger, unwritten narrative about power, loyalty, and the high price of voluntary exile. For the observer navigating this landscape of tradition, the scene presents a flawless facade of continuity, a world where the king, the queen, and the prince and princess of Wales move with the practiced ease of individuals who understand that their visibility is the bedrock of their legitimacy. Surrounding them are the familiar faces of the extended family, the individuals who fill the spaces of public duty and private support, creating a dense network of relationships that has survived decades of scrutiny. Yet, beneath the surface of this impeccable gathering, the emptiness where a brother and a sister-in-law should have stood becomes the defining characteristic of the afternoon, an invisible marker of a deep and seemingly irreversible fracture. The absence is not merely a matter of logistics or scheduling conflicts, but a deliberate statement of the current reality, a stark visual confirmation that the boundaries of the family have been redrawn with absolute precision. To understand how the situation reached this point of chilly finality, one must look beyond the immediate events of the weekend and examine the slow, painful unraveling of bonds that were once thought to be unbreakable. A process that has transformed former insiders into distant spectators as the cameras pan across the assembled guests, capturing the laughter and the easy familiarity of a generation that grew up chasing one another through the vast corridors of holiday retreats. The contrast between the inclusion of the present and the isolation of the absent becomes unavoidable. This gathering of the clan, filled with shared memories of past monarchs and the quiet understandings that only those within the bloodline can truly share, highlights the profound isolation of the couple who chose to seek their fortune across the Atlantic. The narrative surrounding this empty space is often contested, with competing whispers suggesting either a conscious decision to remain clear of the spectacle or a definitive exclusion orchestrated by those who hold the keys to the kingdom. However, the reality of the situation reveals itself not in the conflicting statements of spokespeople, but in the undeniable awkwardness that would have accompanied any potential reunion. An awkwardness born from years of public grievances and deeply personal revelations that have left the remaining members of the family protective of their remaining stability. If you find yourself intrigued by the intricate dynamics of power, tradition, and the hidden human dramas that shape the public face of global institutions, consider subscribing to this channel to stay informed on the deeper stories behind the headlines. The fracture that defines the current state of affairs is not a temporary disagreement that can be smoothed over with a polite conversation or a brief exchange of pleasantries during a festive gathering, but a foundational shift in the structure of the family itself. The sheer bitterness of the divide is most clearly illustrated by the reactions of those who remain at the center of the institution, particularly the Prince of Wales, whose approach to the ongoing separation has hardened into a stance of absolute non-negotiation. The depth of this sentiment is such that the mere presence of the exiled couple would have fundamentally altered the nature of the event, creating an impossible choice for the senior members of the family who refuse to participate in a public display of unity that does not exist in private. This uncompromising boundary is the result of a long accumulation of perceived betrayals, where intimate details of childhood rivalries, physical altercations, and deeply personal assessments of character were laid bare for global consumption, transforming private pain into commercial enterprise and ensuring that the path to reconciliation remains entirely blocked by a mountain of unresolved resentment. The consequences of this separation are felt not just in the social arrangements of the family, but in the very tangible realm of property and presence within the historic estates that form the physical heart of the monarchy. The loss of a permanent foothold in the country of one's birth is perhaps the most significant indicator of this modern banishment, a practical eviction that followed the publication of highly critical memoirs and the release of extensive docuseries that targeted the core of the establishment. For a couple who once envisioned a dual existence, balancing a global philanthropic brand with a historic residence in Windsor Great Park, the realization that their British sanctuary has been permanently revoked represents a profound shift in status. The historic cottage, renovated at immense cost and intended to serve as a secure base for future visits, now stands as a symbol of what has been forfeited. A reminder that actions within a hereditary institution carry immediate and lasting consequences that cannot be mitigated by wealth or external celebrity. This reality leaves the younger brother in a position of complex displacement, balancing a desire to maintain a connection to his homeland with the stark limitations imposed by his current standing, a situation that complicates his efforts to establish a regular presence for his ongoing charitable endeavors. While his partner remains understandably distant from an environment that she has largely rejected, his own efforts to navigate the remaining fragments of his former life create a regular source of tension for the working members of the family, who view these semi-regular returns as a distraction from the organized routine of official duty. The ongoing struggle to find a permanent foothold, to balance the freedom of a new life in California with the residual pull of a historic identity, forms the backdrop to an ongoing drama that continues to play out in the full glare of the international media. A story of an individual trying to reconstruct a sense of purpose in a landscape where his former position has been permanently erased. The unfolding of this domestic drama takes on a sharper, more complex edge when one examines the intricate network of allegiances that still exist among the younger generation of this historic line, where the lines between loyalty to the institution and personal affection become increasingly blurred. While the primary fracture between the two brothers remains the most visible and consequential element of the crisis, the positions occupied by their cousins introduce a layer of subtle intrigue that complicates the narrative of absolute banishment. In particular, the daughters of the Duke of York find themselves navigating a precarious path, maintaining a quiet but enduring closeness with their exiled cousin in California, while simultaneously attempting to preserve their own standing within the active court. Their presence at the recent family wedding, despite the heavy clouds of controversy that have long hovered over their own immediate household, serves as a fascinating study in the internal politics of survival and the shifting sands of royal favor under the current administration. This delicate balance is further strained by the legacy of their father, whose historic financial missteps and highly criticized business associations have left a lasting mark on the family's public standing, forcing the new leadership to adopt a stance of rigorous scrutiny toward any member who might compromise the integrity of the crown. The tension surrounding these relationships is not merely a matter of social awkwardness, but is deeply rooted in the structural reforms being championed by the Prince of Wales, who has demonstrated a growing determination to insulate the future monarchy from the vulnerabilities of the past. Reports from within the inner circle suggest that the future king views the unresolved financial questions surrounding his cousins with a high degree of seriousness, seeing them as potential liabilities that must be addressed before they can cast a shadow over his own eventual tenure. This forward-looking approach has created a palpable friction, as the older methods of handling family difficulties through quiet, internal accommodations are systematically replaced by a demand for greater transparency and accountability. a shift that leaves little room for the sentimental protections of the past. The depth of this philosophical divide became apparent when an offer was quietly extended to the princesses to bring clarity to their complex financial affairs through the intervention of independent, ethical accountants. A gesture designed to definitively separate their personal fortunes from the controversial legacy of their father. The decision to decline this path toward public vindication speaks volumes about the deep-seated resistance within certain branches of the family to the modernizing impulses of the hierarchy. A choice that has reportedly left the Prince of Wales deeply frustrated by what he perceives as a failure to recognize the changing realities of public accountability. This internal dispute highlights a fundamental clash between two entirely different concepts of privilege, where one side views historic status as an absolute shield against external inquiry, while the other recognizes that the survival of the institution depends entirely on its willingness to demonstrate financial rectitude and civic responsibility to a skeptical public. As these hidden tensions continue to simmer beneath the surface of official unity, the exiled prince is preparing to launch a highly coordinated series of appearances in his homeland, a media offensive that is viewed by senior courtiers as a direct challenge to the established routine of the working monarchy. This upcoming schedule, packed with multiple high-profile charitable engagements and media appearances, is widely interpreted as an attempt to construct a parallel court, a pseudo-royal presence that seeks to capture the public imagination and re-establish a powerful personal brand within the British landscape. The timing and scale of this initiative are designed to maximize visibility, ensuring that the former insider remains a dominant figure in the cultural conversation, a prospect that causes considerable anxiety among those responsible for managing the official narrative of the crown. This deliberate strategy of high-impact public engagement reflects a growing realization that the initial dreams of an effortless, star-studded existence in California have encountered significant practical challenges, prompting a strategic pivot back toward the familiar terrain of British philanthropy, even if it must be conducted from the margins of the establishment. The domestic reality of this transatlantic existence is further complicated by the diverging paths of the couple themselves, with the Duchess showing an increasing reluctance to return to a country where she feels deeply unappreciated, leaving her husband to navigate these complex homecomings as a solitary figure. This separation of public spheres underlines the profound difficulty of their shared project, as they attempt to balance the demands of an international media enterprise with the residual obligations and emotional pull of a historic identity that cannot be entirely discarded. For the working members of the family, these solo returns represent a recurring logistical and public relations headache, an unpredictable variable that threatens to overshadow their own carefully calibrated efforts to highlight the steady, dutiful service of the remaining core team. The resulting environment is one of constant vigilance, where every move made by the California branch is analyzed for its potential impact on the standing of the monarchy, creating a permanent state of low-level conflict that drains energy away from the positive, forward-looking initiatives of the court. At the same time, the broader public conversation is increasingly focused on the historic financial privileges enjoyed by various junior members of the dynasty who continue to occupy vast, palatial residences within the royal historic estates under highly favorable financial arrangements that seem increasingly out of step with contemporary economic realities. The revelation that some of these individuals have been utilizing their expansive properties to generate private income through subletting has sparked a wave of public dissatisfaction, forcing a re-examination of the traditional perks that have long been taken for granted behind the palace walls. While official explanations insist that any revenue generated from these arrangements is funneled directly back into the immense cost of maintaining the historic fabric of the buildings, the contemporary audience is demanding a much higher level of detail regarding the flow of wealth within the state-supported institution. This growing demand for absolute clarity represents a significant cultural shift, moving away from an older era of uncritical deference toward a modern expectation of strict accountability, where the right to inhabit historic palaces must be justified by a visible, measurable contribution to the nation. The necessity for structural evolution within this ancient institution has moved from a theoretical debate among historians to an urgent pragmatic reality that will determine its survival in a rapidly changing global landscape. For decades, the financial operations of the dynasty were shielded from intense scrutiny by a combination of public deference and complex historical arrangements that left the exact boundaries between public funds and private wealth deliberately ambiguous. However, the contemporary era has brought a profound transformation in public expectations, driven by a citizenry that demands absolute clarity regarding the administration of national assets and the privileges extended to those born into hereditary status. Prominent critics and constitutional experts have increasingly warned that unless the current administration takes decisive steps to regularize these property arrangements, ensuring that every member of the family pays a realistic commercial rent for their palatial accommodations, the very foundation of the monarchy could face an existential crisis of legitimacy. This shifting landscape highlights a significant generational and philosophical divide at the absolute summit of the royal hierarchy, particularly between the traditional methods of the current monarch and the modernizing impulses of his heir. The king, shaped by a lifetime of waiting and deeply steeped in the historic customs of a previous century, often approaches these delicate family and financial matters with the desire to preserve the established order, sometimes preferring quiet, internal management over radical structural change. In contrast, the Prince of Wales has demonstrated a keen awareness that the future of his inheritance depends entirely on a proactive abandonment of the secretive, highly criticized practices of the past. Rather than waiting for public anger to force his hand, the future king has already begun implementing a series of conscious, forward-looking choices designed to realign the vast resources of his private estate with the pressing needs of contemporary society. His pioneering initiatives to utilize land and financial resources from the historic Duchy of Cornwall to fund the construction of innovative homeless shelters represent a fundamental shift in the definition of royal philanthropy, moving away from symbolic patronage toward tangible, measurable civic problem solving. This deliberate pivot toward a more transparent, socially responsible model of operation reflects a profound understanding of the modern public contract, where the right to exist is no longer accepted as a divine right, but must be earned daily through visible service and ethical leadership. The Prince of Wales appears entirely committed to heralding a completely different era of royalty, one that actively rejects the hidden commercial deals and unearned privileges that have historically caused resentment among the population. To fully comprehend the urgency of this transformation, one must examine the broader histories of the individuals whose actions have brought these issues to a crisis point, most notably the Duke of York, whose turbulent public life and controversial business associations have served as a catalyst for this institutional reckoning. The long history of the House of York, characterized by high-profile marital breakdowns, aggressive financial pursuits, and a persistent failure to navigate the boundaries of official duty, has provided a stark textbook example of the vulnerabilities that can threaten the entire structure when individual entitlement overshadows collective responsibility. The fallout from these controversies has not only isolated those directly involved, but has also created a permanent warning for the generation currently preparing to inherit the responsibilities of the state. The lessons of the past decade have made it abundantly clear that the modern public will no longer tolerate an expansive state-supported family circle whose members enjoy the immense perks of historic status without committing themselves fully to an unblemished standard of public service. This reality explains the uncompromising stance adopted by the heir to the throne regarding both his exiled brother in California and his cousins who remain in the UK, as he seeks to systematically eliminate any potential source of scandal or financial opacity that could weaken the institution before his own reign even begins. The strategic streamlining of the active core team, reducing the number of individuals who represent the crown on the global stage, is a direct response to this pressure, creating a leaner, more focused organization that can be held to the highest standards of accountability. As the former insider continues his complex efforts to carve out a new role for himself through his international charitable foundations, most notably the highly successful Invictus Games. He does so in a landscape where his connection to the active machinery of the British state has been permanently severed. His journey from a central, highly popular figure within the working family to a displaced global celebrity illustrates the immense, unforgiving power of the institution to protect itself from perceived threats, choosing to sacrifice a brother rather than compromise its own survival. The ongoing tragedy of this brotherhood, played out across continents and through the medium of competing public relation strategies, remains a compelling human drama that mirrors the larger institutional struggle between the forces of ancient tradition and the demands of modern reality. While the younger brother seeks to re-establish a sense of purpose and a physical hub within his homeland, he faces a wall of absolute finality from a hierarchy that has moved on. His former responsibilities redistributed among those who chose to remain within the disciplined confines of the established order. Ultimately, the grand gathering observed under the pale English sky was much more than a celebration of family continuity. It was a visible manifestation of a transition period, an absolute boundary line drawn between the past and the future of the monarchy. The absolute absence of some and the highly managed presence of others provided a clear public map of the new territory being forged by a leadership that understands the high stakes of the contemporary era. As the institution prepares for the eventual transition to a new reign, the choices being made today by the Prince of Wales will determine whether this ancient dynasty can successfully adapt to the expectations of a democratic society or whether it will remain dangerously anchored to the privileges of a vanished world. The path forward requires an unyielding commitment to absolute financial transparency, a rejection of personal entitlement, and a profound understanding that the true wealth of a modern monarchy lies not in its historic palaces or its private estates, but in the trust and respect of the people it serves.